wasting much time.
Continue, sir.
We can start?
Yes, yes, please, sir. Continue, sir. We are ready, sir.
Okay. Thank you. So now we start very officially, Henry. Uh, well, today is our 12th dialogue on mediation series, the 12th in the series, and it has been a great experience and a great adventure of having dialogues with senior mediators from all across the world, from different continents. And for your information, Henry, in the first dialogue we had was someone from Peru, and we are continuing this amazing experience of having dialogue with senior people like you. Also, at the outset, let me tell you, we are doing this whole dialogue for ensuring as something a learning material for all our esteemed participants, ranging from very senior officials, bureaucrats, people from the teaching community, etc., for that. So it is really an honor to have you with us, Professor Henry Yampolsky. Professor Henry Yampolsky is an internationally recognized expert in conflict resolution, mediation, and peace building. Henry has worked with hundreds of complex conflicts around the world and has lectured extensively, including the New York Peace Institute, Columbia Institute School of Law, National Museum of America, Jewish History, the Smithsonian Institution, Virginia Tech, and the Satwa Summit in Rishikesh. Henry is the co-founder of the Living Peace Institute and currently works at the Virginia Tech, where he teaches conflict resolution, mediation, and peace building as part of the Virginia Tech's Center for Peace Building and Violence Prevention. He also directs mediation, conflict coaching, and restorative justice programs for Virginia Tech's Office for Equity and Accessibility. He's also he's a very avid author. He's a TEDx speaker, and in fact, in his TEDx talk, he has detailed his motorcycle journey around across the Himalayas and what it taught him about conflict connections and dialogue. Henry has a doctorate of jurisprudence degree from Temple University and has also earned a Bachelor of Science in International Relations from the University of Scranton. Prior to embarking on a career in peace building, Henry was an award-winning trial lawyer in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is also the master teacher of Sattva Yoga, and he has been trained in Rishikesh here in India. It is a great honor for Gandhi Smriti and Darshan Samiti, and as I get from your conversation with you before that you have been in Gandhi Smriti, so it is something which is not a new place for you, except that we are meeting virtually instead of in the physical format. Also, it would be a great thing if Henry, if we could Gandhi Smriti and your department in Virginia Tech can do some programs together. It would be a great honor for us to connect with people whom you teach and the other people. So we really look forward to have something on, say, the Gandhian model of nonviolent communication and those kind of things, Gandhian approach to conflict resolution in the present, 21st century conflicts, so on and so forth. We can discuss further. To start with, if you are ready, we can start with some of those few questions. Also, Mansi will be having a set of questions for you. And the first insight, which we would request you, as you have been traveling across the world and as you have worked with different kind of complex conflicts around the world, we are really eager to know and we request you to kindly share your views on the changing nature of conflicts you find in different parts of the world. And also, please share the views of the Western and the Eastern approaches that you might have encountered during this processes of trying to resolve conflicts in different parts of the world. Yes, please. Professor Henry Yampolsky.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Vedyabas. Thank you, Mansi, for this wonderful introduction. I cannot think for me of a greater privilege than to be speaking with Gandhi Smriti. As you mentioned, Vedyabhas, I've been to India many, many times. I made a pilgrimage to the Gandhi Center, and never even in my wildest dreams could I imagine that I would have this opportunity to be speaking to all of you. So in terms of the changing nature of conflicts around the world, in many ways, the world is getting much smaller. You know, now nearly every conflict is international. Just because the people are much more mobile, just because people's conditioning with internet, with television, with everything else is becoming much, much more uniform. And so in many ways, and of course now, even in this conversation, you know, we're in different parts of the world and we're able to have them more and more. Teams and communities are international in nature. So how does it change the dynamic of the conversations? Well, in some ways, it makes things easier because more and more people around the world have very, very similar cultural references, very, very similar experiences and anticipations. And more, the ideas that people share, the aspirations that people share become quite similar. With that said, any conflict that we're dealing with is ultimately about understanding. And as I teach many of my students, whenever we deal with conflict, the most important aspect of it is to create movement from positions. And our positions can be all over the place, you know, different people around the world based on the conditioning. And most of the arguments we see on television, we see from our politicians, are very positional arguments. And frankly, those arguments don't get us too far. So the next layer, and I very often use an iceberg to illustrate that. From positions, the next layer we move to is interest. Now, for many, many years, the teachings coming out of the Harvard negotiation programs and many others were talking about interest-based negotiations and interest-based conflict resolution. And while I think interest-based takes us in the right direction, in my view, this is not enough. So interest is just the next layer on the iceberg, still well above the water level. And in terms of the positions in interests, you're going to have differences around the world because a lot of it is based on conditioning. A lot of it is based on what people want, what they think they want. As you move down the iceberg, and so then we get to the water level. And at the water level is where we have emotions. Now, of course, culturally, there are different expectations in terms of how acceptable it is to express emotions and how we do so. And I will suggest, especially if we are to use the nonviolent communication model and use it in mediation, emotions are critical. Emotions are absolutely critical because, as Marshall Rosenberg teaches, they are the messengers for our needs. Still, emotions get us only at the water level. They only get us at the water level. We still need to get deeper. And so the next level is the level of values. Now, values, there's going to be some cultural variances in terms of values, although a lot of values we do share as a humanity. The most important layer of conflict resolution, of conflict transformation, of mediation, is getting to the layer of needs. And regardless of where we come from, regardless of what may be our experience, background, conditioning, whether we're from the Himalayas or whether we're from the American South, our needs are going to be the same. And so the key in mediation, in my experience, is shifting from positions to needs. And if we're able to shift that, and this is to me the essence of bringing nonviolent principles that Mahatma Gandhi has talked about, the principles of ahimsa, into mediation. And that is going from positions deeper, 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 and deeper until we finally are able to get to the level of needs. And our needs, regardless of where we come from, are going to be identical. Strategies to meet those needs may be very different. But once we're able to shift the conversation to needs, we're fundamentally transforming a conflict interaction.
Very interesting insights, Henry. Possibly some of the points that you flagged off could be taken up when we have a more elaborate discussion after we complete these few, pointers that really wanted to ask you. And the second pointer in this context is that as you've worked in different parts of the world, how important do you think in various cultures and different societies, they have this very, very traditional and the indigenous knowledge and wisdom, which are very, very useful in negotiating the challenges of many of these conflicts. Like, for instance, I was, in fact, I call her a sister. She works with the USIP in Kenya, and she had recently written an interesting academic paper on the ongoing Tigray crisis in Ethiopia, and she has tried to underline, like the Gachacha court of Rwanda. Similarly, there is some which she says is the traditional justice systems in Ethiopia, and she felt that she has rather stressed and underlined in a paper on the need of how to reactivate or make it more vibrant, so that such kind of traditional systems of justice, traditional wisdoms can help in overcoming some of these crises as they're facing in Tigray. So could you kindly share your own experience of such traditional and indigenous knowledge systems, which are actually very, very useful and vibrant and dynamic in terms of helping in resolving those community level conflicts?
Mm. What a great question, Vedibis. And here, I think we have to draw a distinction first between a very Western approach to dispute resolution and the indigent approaches. And of course, for many, many years, for a variety of complicated reasons that have to do in many ways with even racism, the Western approach has been dominant. And ultimately, the Western approach is based on the principles of progressive exclusion. So, for instance, if we take the criminal justice system, if you take the traditional British criminal justice system, right, which serves as the basis for both the American judicial systems and in many ways for Indian jurisprudence, it's a system of progressive exclusion. And I would suggest to you, and this is again going back to the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, when we start with exclusion, when we start with the idea of exclusion, we are already in violence. That's one of the key ways we express our violence. So many of the indigent systems, instead of focusing on exclusion, focus on inclusion. So, for instance, the restorative justice movement that became very, very significant in North America and in New Zealand has its origins in indigent peace circles. And the idea of the indigent peace circle was to include as many views as possible. If we look at any of the indigent traditions, conflict resolution methodologies and traditions coming from Africa that you referred, there, for example, if someone commits an offense that traditionally in Western-based societies or societies that use Western approach to criminal justice would be viewed as punishment. In many of the indigent traditions there, the focus is on inclusion, on integration. And I want to touch on the indigent tradition that had an immense impact on me, that I bow before deeply, and I will presume has had an impact on you. And that is the tradition that you're coming from. So if we look at the teachings of, to me, one of the best conflict resolution texts is Bhagavad Gita. And I want to bring up the Gita here because, of course, this is something that happens at the battlefield, right? And as Arjuna and Krishna are engaging in their conversation, Krishna does not say to Arjuna, "Let's make love, not war." What Krishna says that is so critical, I think, to the indigent teachings is establish yourself in yoga first and then act from there. And so to me, this is the fundamental shift and a critical fundamental piece of indigent wisdom. Before we can create peace somewhere else, we need to create peace within ourselves. So in essence, we can only give to others what we have. If what we have is fear, anxiety, then that's what we're going to be bringing into the room. So before we can be creating peace anywhere else, we establish peace within ourselves. We establish state of equanimity within ourselves. We establish state of ahimsa within ourselves. And then we act from that state. And then whatever action we take from that state, that action is what's going to be created. That action is what's going to be translated. And I think more and more now I am seeing in terms of conflict resolution and in terms of mediation around the world, I see more and more focus on this approach from the inside out. Approach where we focus on the development of the peace builder first, and then on dealing with the outside factors. And of course, Mahatma Gandhi's life was an immense example of that. Thinking of the feat that he accomplished in uniting a country as complex, as multidimensional as India, in my experience, in my opinion, only was possible because of the very strong personal commitment that he had.
In fact, Henry, your stress on the whole idea of peace within. I remember this beautiful quote of the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who says that peace in oneself, peace in the world. In fact, you have worked extensively in this area in the context of, increasing individualization of the society, fragmentation in different forms, and we are each and every one, many of us are rushing towards those so-called utopian materialistic goals. In that context, even with many things that we might have, there continues to be that churning within, the negative emotions which we can't even discern. We probably have lost that skills of identifying our weaknesses and the strengths, of course, we have. We are very negative in our approach, and we can't find the positives that might be there in the world, especially in the pandemic. Most of the people will get up and think with so many barrage of the media and WhatsApp messages, so many deaths, so they think that nothing good can happen in this world. So there is in a way, a turmoil that is going on within us, the negative tendencies. In that context, going by your own work and your own experience, can you please share your thoughts on how we negotiate actually this whole challenge, so that in the real terms, we look forward to have peace within oneself, so that we contribute to be essentially a peace builder in the world as such? Yes, please.
Yes, what a wonderful question. And I would suggest to you a four-part approach to this that allows us to approach to the world in this perspective, to approach to the world from the perspective of responding to conflict, which I would define as acting, taking appropriate action, taking the right action from an undisturbed state, as opposed to reacting to conflict, which is mostly what we do, and that is attempting to escape or avoid whoever or whatever is triggering us. And the four-part approach, I would say, is this. First is tuning inward. I think it is critical for everyone, for people, for individuals, and even for communities, for societies, to start having some kind of inward focused practices. And the key here, we're doing this practice is not to feel better, not to deal with stress, and not to just feel better, but actually to get better at feeling. To get better at feeling, not to feel better. And I want to emphasize this. This is so critical because I think with everything going on, with all the outside stimuli, with all the access to information, we are actually losing our capacity to feel and to know what is happening within us. And if we are losing that capacity, how can we really communicate? How can we really communicate with others in anything that approaches a nonviolent way? The second dimension of it is observation without evaluation. Jada Krishnamurti talked about observation without evaluation as being the highest form of intelligence. If we notice our speech, if we notice everything we hear and see on television, on the internet, just about everything we see and hear contains some sort of observation, some sort of evaluation, judgment, label, or conclusion. So if we just start developing awareness of how much we use evaluation, judgments, labels, conclusions in our speech, and just start shifting that to observation. The second aspect of this, of observation without evaluation, is developing a culture of active listening. You know, very few people that I see, that I encounter, actually know how to listen. Most of the time, we're not really listening. We're waiting to make our peace. We're waiting to convince. We're waiting to talk about ourselves. And of course, the social media culture that we have does not necessarily promote this culture of active listening. So developing that, I think, is really, really critical. Next aspect of this is expansion. Expansion. This is where, as I talked before, we start expanding from positions to and through interest, to and through emotions and feelings, to and through values, and most importantly, to and through needs. And this is also where we start expanding from identity to humanity. We get so caught up now in various identities that we have. And I very often talk about identity being a boundary. And you know, just like any boundary, it can define and protect us to a point. And then there comes a point where our identities start limiting and confining us. And so this is very, very critical that we start moving beyond the limited identities to identities that are more inclusive, to identities that are more inclusive. Mahatma Gandhi talked about that. He created, as you all know, he created an identity really that encompassed all Indians, that encompassed Indians from different backgrounds, who speak different languages, who come from different castes, different traditions, different experiences. And this is so, so critical at this time for us to start moving beyond these limited identities, because the challenges that we face are not unique to India, to the United States. And the time where we can view the world as just an Indian or as an American or as someone from this part of the world or as a man or as a woman, they're over. The challenges that we're facing are global in nature and will require global cooperation of people. Whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about COVID, none of these challenges care how we identify. You know, what is our little identity? And that's why it's so important for us to start moving beyond that. The final aspect that I would like to share is exploration. And that's where, as my very dear friend Adina Laver pioneered this term, we have to invite curiosity and have courage to be curious in conflict. Courage to be curious in conflict, which means we actually, instead of avoiding conflict, we lean into conflict. and we discover, we explore the dimensions that are there. We explore, we move beyond the binary. So often in conflicts, right, our focus becomes very, very narrow, and we start seeing word in very binary terms, us versus them, right? Pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, blue-red if you're in America, etc., etc., etc. And if we really explore any of these issues, there are many, many dimensions and nuances, and there is complexity in that. And I think exploring that complexity and seeing that nuance, because as human beings, we're all multidimensional, we're all complex, we're all nuanced. And so are the issues that we face. When we start seeing that, our interactions become less binary, and then there is more opportunity to really change these interactions, especially conflict interactions, into opportunities for growth, into opportunities for connection, into opportunities for dialogue.
It's it's a very good learning experience, listening to you, Henry, and this very extremely apt points that you are actually flagging off. So thank you for this wonderful pointers. My next point, which I would request you to kindly give your perspective, because as we know, you have a good understanding, very expert on the various Indian tradition of conflict resolution, and you have been exposed to many of these ideas. So you see, as a student of conflict resolution, and having read some of these ideas, especially from the Eastern perception, one of the striking feature which I feel of the Indian discourse on peace and conflict is how it traditionally allows a fusion of divergent and often contrary viewpoints. In fact, the quest for balance or a middle path appears to be a practical trajectory to reconcile the diverse viewpoints that laces India's multicultural society. Such flexibility on social and community life in turn has discouraged, as we were talking about the binaries, and had instead led to a growth of non-dualistic understanding. The non-dualistic schema is also reflected traditionally in the way questions of war and peace have been articulated, the narratives and the texts of some of these, martial traditions and warfare would thus combine with an equally impressive dialogue on peace building practices. So both being there together in that sense. It is not uncommon in Indian heritage to find these great episodes of violence, juxtaposed with these great acts of non-violence and vice versa. So I would really request you to kindly share your perspective on this whole idea, which I felt I could share with you.
Mm. So, of course, expanding beyond the binary is so critical. Sadhguruji, great modern Indian sage, talks so often about it. The need for us as human beings to expand and to naturally become more inclusive. And when we naturally become more inclusive, binary in a way becomes impossible, right? Binary becomes impossible because there is plurality, as of course so many Indian teachings teach us. Our world is a constant intersection of plurality and singularity. And again, I want to reiterate it, to me, in my perspective, the most important way for us to start expanding beyond the binary so that we don't just see us versus them, black, white, everything in these terms, because the media that's what the media is presenting to us. And that becomes very much the discourse on social media. People are very quick to put a label, to put a conclusion, to put an evaluation on something. And here, the ultimate invitation, I think the ultimate invitation of the yoga tradition is to be open, to be open to everything, and to be open to both that plurality and to singularity, and to continue to continuously expand ourselves, and to continue to consistently discover, again, as Sadhguruji said, what is us, fundamentally, what is us and what is ours. And having that distinction, right, between all the things that we have accumulated, all the accumulations that ultimately is our body, that ultimately is our mind. It's all accumulation of information, judgment, ideas. And so having that ultimate distinction between what is ours and what is us, in my view, is what allows us then to hold these multiple ideas and the complexity and the nuance without feeling the need to getting attached to the particular identity, to a particular way of viewing things. Because the moment that we do, the moment that we get attached to a particular identity, we start seeing the world in a very, very limited way. And once that happens, conflict becomes inevitable. But of course, I also would like to add to that that conflict is not a negative thing. None of the scientific discoveries, none of the ways we understand the world would in many ways exist without conflict. Someone had questioned what is happening in the world, how we see the world, saw the world different, very often faced great opposition because they saw the world differently. But ultimately, conflict is something that can bring that is part of our evolution, that is part of the opportunity for us to grow and to discover, to innovate as human beings. So conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. I think where the issue becomes if we are reacting to conflict, and when we are reacting to conflict from just this perspective of neuropsychology, our activity transitions from the prefrontal cortex to the brainstem. So we become incapable of rational thought. And it just becomes about defending or attacking, escaping or controlling. Or are we able to respond to conflict? Are we able to maintain an undisturbed state and then take whatever is the right action from that undisturbed state? And sometimes the right action is for us to just hear, to listen, to see all the different dimensions that these issues have, and not to be so quick to form a conclusion or an opinion which immediately limits us, which immediately puts us in that box.
Uh, Thank you very much. My next, my next question would be in the context of the Gandhian model of conflict resolution. Also, I will be having a few more, pointers which I would request you to kindly share after this. Also, in between, Mansi also would like to, ask you a few questions. So after this, point of mine about Gandhi's model, I would be requesting Mansi to kindly share her questions for you. And in this context, when, as again a student of, you know, as a student of Gandhi, there is a very interesting quotation of his, which I really like, when he says that we are, constantly being astonished at the amazing discoveries in the field of violence. But I maintain that far more, undreamt of and seemingly impossible discoveries will be made in the field of non-violence. In fact, Gandhi has drawn from various Hindu perspectives, the Sanatani Hindu perspectives, his own, idea of non-violence, and also from, of course, from the other religions. Gandhi envisaged a holistic and sustainable vision of sustainable peace, which I believe, and his vision of a non-violent, civilization is essentially a critique, as we saw in Hind Swaraj, of the modern state and its paradigm of violence. He has no doubt that the modern state based on force is incapable of dealing with the forces of disorder, whether external or internal. And he firmly believed that the positive peace cannot be brought only by peaceful means and never by non-peaceful means. In this context, you see, with the changing nature of conflicts and so on and so forth, the more complex models of conflict resolution that we have, how do you, place, or how does the Gandhian approach to conflict resolution essentially fit into the, the more contemporary and the modern models of conflict resolution? I would request you to kindly share your views in that.
Sure, sure. So in responding to that, I would like to actually quote my teacher, who's based in Rishikesh. His name is Anand Mehrotra. And what Anand very often taught me was that there are two types of violent people in the world. Those who are just have not been triggered enough, and that's the majority. And then a small number of people who are aware of their violence and then are doing something about that. Those people are aware of our, in some ways, inherently violent nature and are doing something about it consciously. And to paraphrase Sadhguru, to me, this is about from moving from compulsive action to a conscious one. And this is, as I understand, very respectfully, this is what Gandhi's teachings were about. Moving to the version of ahimsa, where ahimsa is not just some stale concept that is outside of us, and it's something that is just floating in the ether, and we can quickly dismiss if we say that we don't kick puppies and we donate to charities, therefore we live a nonviolent life. No, I think this requires a much deeper examination and a much deeper practice. What are we doing to face our own violence? And then I think from there, it becomes the question of what we focus on. Do we focus on the fruit? Do we focus on the root? Or do we begin with the seed? And I would suggest to you that the seed is how are we inside of us? How are we inside of us? Because ultimately, if we look at the world systems, at all the violent ways that humans act, at all the cruelty that humans are inflicting on each other and on this planet, right? These are all human beings. They're human beings like you and I who are responsible for this, who are bombing children, who are producing weapons, who are doing all of those things. They're not some systems. They're not some machines, right? So I think the first step is for us to start by looking within and start doing something about our own violence. And then we start developing the capacity for responding to outside circumstances as opposed to reacting. And of course, our responses, we have all the elements in our body. Our responses can come through a variety of different ways. It's not that every response that we come into namaste and just take it sitting down. Sometimes the appropriate response is fire, right? We have to take a very fiery action, and of course Gandhi did that in many different ways. He was very strong. No one could I think refer to Gandhi and his experience and what he has done for India as displaying any kind of weakness, right? But it's all where it was coming from. It was coming from a space of peace. It was coming from a space of compassion. It was coming from a place of inclusion. So sometimes the appropriate response will be fire. Sometimes the appropriate response is water. We just let something flow away. We're not going to engage with that. Sometimes it is earth. We become very nurturing towards someone, especially if we're dealing maybe with a child, with a younger person, right? Sometimes it's air. We speak our truth. And sometimes it's ether. We rise above something. So I think approaching conflict, and especially complex conflicts around the world from this dimension, and the dimension is we start with ourselves first. Because ultimately, right? If we let's just use two examples of in some ways diametrically opposed people without taking any kind of political position or anything like that. But if we would see Dalai Lama and Donald Trump in the same situation, I suspect their actions in that situation would be different. Why? Because they're different people. They're approaching life from a very, very different perspective. And so the more we can cultivate with us that awareness of our own violence, do something about it, have a disciplined personal practice as Gandhi did for many, many years, the more our idea of ourselves will start expand. And if our idea of ourselves expand, the more we start seeing everyone and everything as part of us. If we start seeing life that way, the harder it becomes for us to do something that doesn't value that life, whether it's a life of another person, whether it's a life of a river, whether it's a life of another being.
That's so aptly said, Henry. That's really very insightful. Now, may I request Mansi to please share her perspective for Henry? Yes, Mansi.
Thank you, Veda sir. Uh,
Yeah. Namaskar, Mansi.
Namaskar, sir. It has been an enriching experience so far, and I have learned a lot from you, sir. And there are a few things which I want to explore. And since your profile is so rich, you have learned a lot from India and from Western world as well. So there's something I would like to know upon how do you look at Bhagavad Gita? See, Mahabharata in the Indian tradition is known for the tradition of war. How, as in, whenever somebody quotes Mahabharata, people will think of war and not of what it actually indicates. See, you had just mentioned that about the Arjun and Krishna's conversation, that Krishna had asked Arjuna to first get into that yoga mode to develop that awareness of who you are and why are you doing that, and then act from there. So when we talk about violence, people do not understand what violence actually means. Just you have like you mentioned that violence to Gandhi was not sitting idle when a person needed to act. Violence to him did not mean that you just take a slap and keep waiting for another. Violence will have different dimensions for different people. So we all are inherently violent. If we look at the earth, and when we talk in the context of pandemic, see, we all, everybody is going to react after a certain point. But the only thing in my eyes which differentiates between violence per se and violence, which we are talking in general terms, is that what is the intent behind our action. If it is to derive justice, then it is justified, because karma is the ultimate thing, the ultimate duty of every individual. So when I talk about non-violence, I look at being duty bound as one of the main elements of non-violence. You cannot just sit idle and wait for other people to keep on doing what they are doing. So it is even if in the context of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna had asked Arjuna to perform his duty, and inner awareness in this sense was that you have to fight for what is wrong, no matter what is going to be the losses which will be incurred in return. So how do you look at being duty bound, irrespective of what results we may get from that duty, that karma which we are supposed to perform as an element, an essential element of non-violence or non-violent communication?
Bansi, what a great question, and what a great point you're raising. And here I would echo what you had said. As I understand the great text that you are referring to, and bow down to the immense wisdom that they contain, it is about our intent. Yoga tradition is not a tradition, and many people fundamentally misunderstand this tradition when they think it's a tradition of just sitting somewhere and meditating. It is about action and about taking action. And the key here, and the key, as you, Mansi, mentioned, what Bhagavad Gita teaches is where the action is coming from, and that's the seed. And that's the seed that then allows the root of the action to take place. And then the fruit is the action. And that, again, key here is what is the right action for the circumstances? What is the right action for the circumstances? Sometimes the right action is for us to bow down to something and not do anything. And sometimes it is to become very, very fiery. But Mansi, as you pointed out, truly the key is establishing this state of equanimity within us, establishing that state of peace within us, where no matter what is happening in the world, we are fully engaged with the world, but we are not affected by it. We are engaged with the world, but we are not entangled with what is going on. And then we can take the right action. The right action. And as we practice taking the right action, of course, and please correct me if my understanding is incorrect, if I'm wrong, but once we start taking spontaneous right action, that's when we're in Dharma, right? That's when we're in Dharma. That is the nature of the dharmic action. When we spontaneously take the right action, and there is no stress within us, we're able to spontaneously respond to the world without feeling like we're stressed, without becoming violent within us. And then the action takes the nature of the action we take, it has to be appropriate for the circumstances. Sometimes sometimes the most nonviolent thing we can do, sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is to stand up and fight very, very strongly for what needs to happen. Sometimes the situation calls for something different. But I think we have to be very careful in saying that nonviolent action only looks a particular way. I have met a lot of people in India and all over the world who, they spend a lot of times, sitting and maybe not doing much and sometimes smoking, different things that they thought were helping them. Inside, they were quite violent. So maybe on the outside, their actions were not violent. They were creating violence in the world. So Mansi, again, to come back to your point, I think how we are determines what we're bringing into the world, whether it's peace, whether it's compassion, or whether it's violence. And if we're violent, anxious, depressed within, that's where we have to start. So then the right action is able to arise from within us, from the right space.
Absolutely, sir. Because the inward focus practices are very essential in today's world, which is conflict on. And we need to understand the better we get, the better we will get. We attract the things. Whatever we are, we will attract the same thing. There's a very famous book named Secret. It says that whatever you keep thinking, whatever you keep making out of yourself, that is going to come to you. And people believe that conflict is actually something very, very harmful. It is going to end the world. But conflicts, if we look in the into the Indian tradition, whether we mention Ramayana or Mahabharata, those conflicts have made the world a better place to live in, because they had those elements which were anti-social, which were evil, and which were not required in the society so that the society prospers. So conflict is not necessarily a negative thing, as you had mentioned earlier, sir. But as we read in the peace literature, and you have also mentioned that to get into the root cause of conflicts, we need to identify the needs. from positions, values, we come to the needs. And conflicts basically arise because there different people will have different ways to fulfill those needs. We essentially have same needs, like you have mentioned, but the means to fulfill them will be different. So here there will be a role of biases which we have as human beings in the fulfillment of these needs. Coming to the process of mediation, sir, these biases will come into play, whether you are a mediator or whether you are a conflicting party. So they will play a role in how the mediation process is going to happen, is going to take some shape. The flow of mediation will depend upon these biases. So what uh, suggestions will you give so as to handle these biases? Because being humans, we cannot completely remove them, sir, but they need to be kept under control, sir. So what are your suggestions to keep these biases at bay so that the mediation processes can be successful?
Mm. Mansi, what a great question, because of course bias, and especially implicit biases, biases that we're not even aware of, but something that is conditioned within us based on some association, um, is something that impacts people. And of course, the research shows that this is something that impacts the actions that we take. So what a important and wonderful question, Mansi, relating to biases. So couple things here. First of all, I would like to talk about what is kind of the opposite, the antidote of violence. So very often we talk about the antidote of violence is peace. The opposite of violence is peace. And I will suggest that the opposite of violence is inclusion. And so anytime there is bias, implicit bias, explicit bias, what we are doing is that we're othering someone, we're othering another being. And so the invitation here, the broad invitation, is for us to start living a life of radical inclusion, refusing to other anyone. So how do we do that? How do we do that? And I think, Mansi, once again, it comes down to awareness, to self-examination, engaging in practices that take us deep within, that will naturally make us more inclusive, that will naturally make us more expansive. That is very, very critical. But also questioning ourselves when we take an action, asking why. Asking why, why did I act this way towards this person that I just encountered? Would I act the same way if this person was somehow different? If they came from a different background, different experience. And I think coming to the context of mediation, this is where I think two of the most important skills that any mediator could have really come in. And those skills are engaging in consistent active listening very, very deeply to what is arising in the mediation, to what people are saying, and then asking very curious, very open-ended questions, and being very, very conscious and aware when someone may feel excluded in any way. Very often when I mediate situations, I will check in with the parties, sometimes often individually in a caucus setting, and I will ask them, how are you feeling? How's it going for you? And then very often I will ask, is there anything that I am doing that maybe is creating any kind of discomfort for you as you're in the mediation session? And my hope is that by asking these questions, by establishing this level of trust and relationship with the parties, I hope the parties will tell me if my implicit biases come into the play so that I can address them. And when people share, sometimes it's not easy to hear, when you say to me, hey, what you just asked, what you just did in the mediation session was uncomfortable, or hey, I'm noticing maybe you're not making as much eye contact with me. And for me, the key is to maintain that openness maintain that curiosity, be grateful for that feedback, and then see how, be able to look back at what and how I was doing and see how something that how something that I did impacted that being. So Mansi, again, I would say that it's going within, it's developing awareness of our biases, and then in the context of mediation, listening as closely as we can, practicing active listening, asking open-ended questions, and consistently using the nonviolent communications, consistently trying to discover and identify what needs are not being met. What can I do to meet those needs? And sometimes I would even ask, is there anything that I could do to make the process more comfortable, more engaging, more inclusive? So Mansi, I hope that addresses your point.
Absolutely, sir. But this brings me to another question. You had mentioned earlier that observation without evaluation is the highest form of knowledge, and also developing awareness about the situation, about the needs, requires some higher degree of intellectual integrity. So, the parties who are engaged in a conflict certainly do not have that ability to understand what they are experiencing. So here the role of mediator becomes very significant. But then
Mhm.
there is a debate uh, which me and Vera sir have always encountered when we talk about community mediation, that mediators are not people who need to have some special skill sets. They are people who are community oriented, who are willing to find some solutions. But
Mm,
when we talk about when we say that a mediator needs to observe without evaluating, or mediator needs to have certain degree of awareness, certain of his own emotion, his or her own emotions and the emotions of the parties. Here we are referring to people who are very professional, who have developed that inward focus, that ability to differentiate between what is right and wrong. So, what is your take on this? That mediators need to be highly professional people, or people coming from the community who understand the community needs can also
mm,
be mediators without
mm,
acquiring professional
mm.
or professional skill sets?
Mansi, what an important question. And I think this question really raises, I think it goes deeper than just what is the role of the mediator, how should mediators be? It really raises a point of what is the point of mediation and what is mediation, right? Because if we start with that, what is mediation and why do we engage mediator, then we can figure out what kind of mediators we need to be effective in this process. And I know, if you go around the world and even in India and in North America, there are a variety of different views of what mediation is. So some will view it as just a process, a more efficient, effective process of resolving disputes and reaching settlement. You mentioned, another view that, mediator is there to help parties find the solution. I actually do not agree with either of those views. I do not believe mediation is just a more efficient way to reach settlement, nor do I believe mediation process as being purely solution oriented. Um, I am more of a proponent of a transformative mediation model, which was proposed by American professors Joseph Foger and Baruch Bush. And the transformative mediation model looks at mediation fundamentally as a process of expansion, as a process of discovery, as a process of understanding. So then the point of mediation is not to come with a solution. In essence, we're moving in mediation from problem solving to empowerment. So if we view mediation as an empowering and an expansive process, not just a process of finding middle ground, of finding a solution, or for mediator to be a problem solver, I think what's important for mediator as a qualification is the first ability to be multi-partial. And I want to distinguish between multi-partiality and neutrality. Neutrality suggests that mediator, upon entering the mediation space, mediation room, strips off any thoughts, ideas, biases, experiences that they may have had, and in essence is just a blank slate. And I don't think that's realistic. What I invite is multi-partiality. Mediators, they're caring deeply about each of the parties, both all the parties involved. Mediators, they're caring deeply about the process and delivering a high quality process. But also in being multi-partial, mediator is not there to see that one party or the other, wins, quote unquote. And so if the role of the mediator is then to create a space that is expansive, that is safe, a space for understanding and for self-discovery, the qualifications of a mediator are not necessarily someone who knows the subject matter or maybe is seen as a sage in the community, but rather, as I see it, Mansi, the qualifications of the mediator then would be as someone who is capable of holding space for all the participants and for empowering all the participants by listening to them very, very intently, by asking open-ended questions, by being available, by holding space for their emotions, but allowing people to discover their values. Those to me are much more important qualifications. The ability of mediator to do that, rather than a knowledge in a particular subject matter or being seen, as having some kind of specialized knowledge by the participants. And so in that, the capacity to do that, the capacity to engage with people in that way, that's where personal practice comes in. If we view mediators, someone who creates an expansive space, someone who is there to empower the parties, then that person has to have certain capacity within themselves. That person has to have certain capacity within themselves developed. And that's where I think the most important quality of a mediator is not degree or knowledge, but ultimately, how do they show up? How do they show up into the room? Can they show up into the room where their presence, their mere presence, makes people comfortable, makes people feel like they're being heard, makes people feel like they're being engaged, and gives them the opportunity to really become very, very creative. So that then the parties themselves, with the help of the mediator, can begin the process of discovering their needs, of discovering their values, and then shifting the dialogue. Shifting the dialogue where it's not about the mediator coming up with some brilliant idea, but about her, the mediator, creating space for the parties to do so.
What a delightful answer, sir.
Yeah, very, very interesting insight. In fact, Henry, it would be wonderful if you can share some a few of your most challenging, uh, work on mediation from any part of the world you have done. The most challenging you feel, if you could really share with us, and how you
Sure.
actually ended up in, trying to bring those parties together, even in communication.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So one challenging experience happened actually right at the university where I work, and part of my job is to deal with help people deal, whether it's students, whether it's faculty and staff, help them deal with some very challenging conflicts that arise. So on our campus, we had a situation where a group of Jewish and Israeli students were having an event. And as part of this event, they posted an Israeli flag outside one of the buildings on campus. And this was something that was very, very offensive to some of the Muslim students in our community, to some of the students who identified as Palestinians. And so one of the students who identified in that way was walking by the student center, tore down the flag, and threw it in the garbage. And so, as you can imagine, these are very, very charged identities, right? These are very charged identities that are in very intense ongoing conflict with each other. And I am in Southwest Virginia, pretty far from Middle East, much further than you are. And in many ways, this is where the Middle Eastern conflict, in all its dimensions and complexity, came into our community and into our small community in Southwest Virginia. And so my job was to help these individuals, to see how to get through this situation. And I'm very fortunate where in our community, the invitation was to deal with the situation in a restorative way through the restorative justice process, as opposed to just through the process of exclusion and punishment, because the idea was, how can we take these young people and help them grow from this experience? And so what did I do in this situation? Well, as I talked about earlier, I tried to apply the four principles, the four dimensions that I talk about. So first, tuning inward. So I spent time meeting individually with most of the students involved in this situation. And this was to create a safe space for them to go within, so that they could, really tune in to what they were feeling, to what they were needing. And of course, it was not just a binary, the situation may seem to be binary, but it wasn't. Everyone, all the folks involved and in this issue had very actually complex feelings about what transpired and very complex situations. And so I met individually with students. We had a series of meetings, and then we created space for all the students from from who were impacted by the situation. So including the accused student, including the students who felt that they were hurt by the situation, to come together in a meeting. And by the way, also to go back in the individual meetings, this is where also I was doing a lot of observation without evaluation through active listening. And by active listening, I was communicating to the students that this was a very, very safe space, that I'm not going to judge them, that I'm here to just simply listen to what is arising for them. So then the students did come together. And when they came together, and this was in the midst of COVID, so there were a lot of challenges in doing this virtually on Zoom. But what I did was I started with a little ceremony when we came together. And the ceremony, as part of the ceremony, I lit up an oil lamp. And of course, as you know, oil lamp has a tremendous meaning in the yoga tradition. It also has significant meaning in Islam and in Judaism. And I lit an oil lamp to commemorate anyone in our community and beyond who felt excluded. And then we invited the students to go around the circle and share who they were, share how this experience impacted them, and modeling very, very active listening for all the others. And this, where we come to the third element that I discussed, expansion, right? And you could see there was a palpable expansion of energy in the room, right? The students who came into this room, this virtual room, seeing themselves only as a very particular narrow identity, all of a sudden we're realizing that someone that they were perceiving as their foe, as their enemy, as someone who threatened them, was actually not so different from them. And then we went to, in this circle, we went to exploration. So we tried to explore the nuance of how different students may be feeling. And again, it wasn't, a lot of folks had very, very mixed feelings about the situation, about how it transpired. On one side, there was a perception that this was a incident directed towards one specific group, and on the other side, there was a perception that this was more a political statement, not directed at someone's ethnicity or religion, but more a political statement, because of the perception of what Israel is doing in the Palestinian territories. So we really leaned into that. We didn't avoid conflict. We talked about that. And then we created space for exploration of ideas, where we separated idea generation from idea evaluation. And this is really, really critical because it allowed these students to really engage with each other, right? And to bring creativity to conflict. And so the result of that was that the students decided that, instead of talking to each other in terms of labels and conclusions and judgments, which they may be getting from media, they wanted to get to know each other more as individuals. And so they agreed to have dinner together. They agreed to do some programming together, some events together, to just see, the humanity in each other. And while they still had very, very profound disagreements, to me, this was a very powerful experience because ultimately, this was an experience, of course, in a very microcosmical way, right? But this was an experience where a group of very courageous, brilliant young people, in a right environment, was able to move from very, very distinct and strong identities to the humanity that we share, to the humanity that we ultimately share. And so, to me, this situation gave me a lot of hope. There were also other challenges that came up later with outside groups and Twitter, and we live in a very complicated world. And yet, the fact that two groups of students who felt very, very strongly about a particular situations, who held very, very strong identities, were able to come together in this way and experience each other's humanity and expand was very, very meaningful to me and gave me a lot of hope for all of us.
Really very insightful points that you shared with us, and I think this kind of experiment, this kind of interventions needs to be probably practiced and thought of in various conflict zones across the world. And here I am actually tempted to ask you, yeah, I've been working with this group of students from the Herat province of Afghanistan. In fact, I myself have conducted several virtual workshops for them on nonviolent communication and all. But going by the situation in Afghanistan now, in fact, every second day I get this feedback from the students. Incidentally, these are all girl students. And in fact, yesterday she sent a voice message. All school, they've just completed school. They said that the Taliban is almost all set to take over their province. So in the context of what we are seeing in Afghanistan today and various other conflict zones, is there any hope for any non-violent intervention to even succeed? No, you beautifully explained your own experience with this Palestinian and Israeli groups. But even in this unsurmountable, situation, unprecedented situation, say in Afghanistan, we find in Yemen such a situation. So many of these real conflict zones. Is there any glimmer of hope that possibly non-violence will have some space, or it is going to be all, completely violent takeovers in all these areas, or violence continues?
What a great question, and what a difficult question, Vedabis. I always think there is hope, but also I think what makes things very, very difficult is what journalist Amanda Ripley, who just released recently a brilliant book called High Conflict, refers to as conflict entrepreneurs. And these are people, individuals, groups who are profiting from the division. And in the case of Afghanistan or Yemen, this also unfortunately includes religious leaders and other leaders who present a very, very dogmatic view of the world, and who ultimately are very, very afraid, and thus are presenting a very, a very limiting view of the world, and a view of the, and this is, I think, common in India as well. I know you also have a number of folks who see world in a very binary, dogmatic way. And these folks are very, very dangerous. These folks are very, very dangerous because, especially of the influence that they have and the ability now to access the internet, to disseminate their message, they're able to influence young people into and indoctrinate young people into this worldview. You know, that there's us and them, and there's a particular way of being us. And if someone is not follow that particular way, then those people are enemies, unworthy of living, unworthy of human dignity, unworthy of respect. And I believe the way to address this is not through persuasion. I actually don't think it is realistic for us to persuade, because then we're still arguing on a positional level. We're still arguing on a positional level, right? And in many ways, persuasion, we're trying to appeal to someone's logic, we're trying to appeal to someone's rationality. That's not what works. That's not what works. I think what works in those situations are experiences and situations where people could have and nuanced interactions with those they quote unquote consider as the other. And they can start creating dialogues, connections, with those individuals, and see them as individuals and not just as some kind of label. So I think it's very hard in places like Afghanistan, in places like Yemen, where you have long history of dysfunction, corruption, where you have other forces and countries and interests who've intervened and often made matters much worse, and destroyed a lot of the infrastructure, destroyed a lot of the education. And yet, I think there is hope, especially when we were talking about young people, because they're more open, they're naturally more open, they're naturally more curious. For them to engage directly in a very direct way with people whom they perceive as enemies. And then in just engaging with them, sharing a meal with them, sharing stories, not trying to persuade, they start seeing the humanity. They start seeing that we are not so different. And then what we start slowly doing is creating, of course, a new generation of leaders, a new generation of people who don't see the world in very dogmatic us versus them terms.
Absolutely true, in fact. But of course, both of us are on the same line when say the situation is extremely complex and these people are extremely dangerous. Like this girl who is the, sort of this team leader of this group, in fact, whom I motivated to do this almost 15 days peace building workshop in just in January, February this year. And we had such series of very exciting workshop with this group of young girls, and they are so badly petrified that those people are coming and asking their families the names of the in which family how many girls are there. And she said that we are already marked because we work with some organizations like yours at an international level, India or United States or the other countries. So we are already marked, and anything can happen. So it's a very dangerous situation at this stage, and we can really hope possibly something will happen to ensure that some kind of a tranquility or peace continues there. Well, in fact, I think if we keep on actually conversing, we will keep on conversing because it's such a fascinating area and such a great, and really we are enjoying it. But I am sure you will have a lot of work. It's the morning hour, and I think we should have time for a second dialogue. But before we conclude, I think I should, even though I had more questions for you, but I think uh, instead of, we can't have it in one particular episode of this conversation. I could request Mansi if she had some more questions for you before we wind up, and with the promise that we want to, quote unquote, extract a promise from you that we will have a second round of dialogue. And of course, we would love to work together on different ideas and things, especially at an level of where we could have some of these points, like bring in people from some of these unique identities, and even if it is a virtual kind of a session, to have discussions on this in the context of the space that needs to be there for non-violence and peace. Mansi, please.
Thank you, Veda sir. Certainly, one session will not be enough for us, sir. We have enriched our minds, our knowledge regarding the concept of peace, regarding non-violence. So there is just one question, because I have a lot of queries. Because you are such a learned person, you have given us so much in such a short duration of time which we had. So we would certainly love to hear from you again. But just one more question before this session ends. So right now, Veda sir had asked you a question regarding these international conflicts which are going on. And when we talk about conflicts, we being peace lovers, we being Gandhians, we believe in sticking to non-violence in every situation. But then, as we had earlier talked about, that non-violence will have different dimensions for different people. It does not mean inaction, sir. So when we talk about the girl, which sir was referring to, that she's petrified by the situation, but she cannot just be peaceful in the sense that she cannot, uh, of course, she cannot be violent, but she cannot stop acting. She has to take a stand for herself in these situations. So how do you look at non-violence? What are the elements of non-violence in these kind of situations? When there is no option, the other party is very violent, and still you have to be peaceful enough to ensure that the peace prevails. So what will be a non-violent communication? What will be the elements of non-violent communication in such kind of situations?
Mm. First of all, Mansi, thank you for this question, and it's not an easy one. First of all, I feel immense sadness that the international community has failed these girls and has created through acting in very violent ways. Both the international community and so many others have in many ways created the situation where these girls in Afghanistan are threatened and cannot are living in fear and are living in fear of their lives and their lives are going to be fundamentally changing because of the ascension of Taliban. With that said, I think if we start looking at nonviolence, the key to nonviolence, I see nonviolence and nonviolent communications and really everything that we talked about as compassion and action. So what is compassion? What is compassion? Compassion is fundamentally seeing humanity in all of us. And that includes um, people who may not, in our view, may not be deserving, so may not we who are acting in the world in the most violent way. Um, there is a brilliant book by Viktor Frankl and called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Victor, and to me, this book really provides the answer, Mansi, that you're seeking. So, Viktor Frankl, to talk a little bit about his history, Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who was imprisoned in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And Viktor Frankl witnessed and was subjected to the most incredible cruelty and violence anyone could imagine. In front of his own eyes, his wife and daughter were executed. And yet, and this is a brilliant book that I recommend, Mansi and Vedyabhas, and I believe it is available. Actually, I think it is available in Hindi, and I think it was released in India too. And yet, Viktor Frankl made it his mission and his focus to see humanity, even in the people who were committing the most unspeakable acts, to him personally, to his family, and to his people. And in that, Viktor Frankl discovered a real freedom. And the freedom was no matter where we are, no matter how we are, we have the ability to respond. In other words, we have the ability, whatever is happening on the outside of us, whatever cruelty we may be experiencing, whatever pain we may be experiencing, we have the ability to choose how we are inside of us. And even with these most horrible things happening on the outside, he made a deliberate choice inside of him to cultivate joy, to cultivate peace, to cultivate compassion. And in that, Viktor Frankl was really able to see the ultimate freedom. He was able to see the freedom where what was happening on the outside, whatever his circumstances were, and they were terrible, they were absolutely awful, they were not going to define him as a human being. They were not going to define how he was going to act towards others. And so, Mansi, to bring this full circle, the answer to everything is establish yourself in yoga and then act from there. Whatever is happening on the outside, whatever terrible circumstances, whatever cruelty, whatever violence, if we can again tune in, if we can, to the extent possible, cultivate peace, kindness, compassion within us, and see the world from that lens, and see even tormentors, even people who commit the worst acts of violence through that lens, then just by our very, very presence, we may not be able to do much in the situation, but just by our very, very presence, people around us, including whether it's the Nazis, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's any other circumstance, also start becoming transformed.
Wonderful, sir. Wonderful. I think this is the
Yes,
technique which Gandhi used during his entire lifespan to be what he wanted to show up as, to be non-violent. He transformed the hearts of the opponent. So thank you so much for this enriching experience. Thank you.
in fact, to be very frank, I have read about this book, but to be very frank, I've never read this book so far, Henry. And now I think you have really motivated me that I must immediately go to the online platform and order this book, because I think it is a must-read book to have a greater insight. Thank you for this very profound, understanding. And as I said, that we would request you, rather extract from you, as now you are a good friend, on how we can work together further, especially to look at some of these spaces of promotion of non-violence and conflict transformation processes and non-violent communication, how we can work, say possibly have a session with your students, or identify, like I was very much before we were going to have this dialogue in the morning here, I was thinking, like, I was really impressed by this whole course which this Indonesian university has organized, where they have participants right from Barbados to Latin America to Europe and so on, so forth, to think of such kind of a interesting, say, 3 days kind of a or a 4 days kind of a capsule kind of a sessions of a very high interest of people who are really interested across the globe on promotion of peace. So if you could think on those terms, and we can think of having a joint kind of a offering them more of a these looking at say the Gandhian or the Kingian approach to some of these issues and various other scholars. It would be a wonderful, collaboration, I suppose, that would be, and some kind of a contribution we could do to this whole culture of peace. I request you humbly to think of it on how we can work together further, and also we would look forward to have another session with you. Incidentally, the best part is that the next person with whom we are going to have a dialogue, she's a Malaysian mediator, and her name is Intan, and again the person who introduced me is again Elizabeth. And according to Intan, she has only one hero in her life, and that is Mahatma Gandhi. And she said that she is so happy and excited that because she happens to be an alumni of the same place as Gandhi studied law, that is the Inner Temple in London. So we are going to have, so you have a great understanding, and you have given us a wonderful insight on the whole idea of Gandhian approaches, and even the next person from Malaysia who will be. I don't know if you know Intan. Do you know Intan by any chance?
Intan? No, I do not.
Okay. Fine. So we are going to have in August with her. But you please tell us, and we will be in touch with each other so that we can work out something very constructive and meaningful. That would be very useful, I suppose, if we can work together further. And also probably look forward to have some kind of have some academic writings and things like that, and that would be and discourses further.
Yes,
Yes, please.
yes, that would be such an honor. I want to emphasize again how much of an honor it is for me, and I cannot wait till the day where I can once again visit Gandhi Smriti and bow down to the great Mahatma, bow down to each and every one of you for the immense work that you're doing. This is, you're creating an inspiration for all of us, for all the peace builders around the world. And I cannot wait till the time when we can be in the same physical space and share chai
Yeah,
together
that's
and,
something
and engage in
we are
some
all
great
yearning for.
great discourse and great dialogue. And certainly, I would welcome the opportunity, to collaborate and work together and to explore, these dimensions of nonviolence, and to continue to work together to bring this to everyone around the world.
In fact, in the next few days, I will, share